Welcome to the Mercator Institute for China Studies and to this MERICS Future China lecture with the anthropologist Professor Xiang Biao. My name is Bernhard Bartsch. I'm the Director for External Relations here at MERICS, and together with my colleague Katja Drinhausen, who heads our research program on Chinese politics and society, I have the pleasure to host you for today's speech and discussion. For our MERICS Future China lectures, we invite leading experts and peers to help us understand and think through some of the big questions concerning China's future. And today's talk and discussion will literally tag future China, because we're going to talk about the young generation that is going to shape China's future in the coming decades. And of course, it is a generation that is growing up and coming to age at a time of unprecedented changes and a very specific set of social and political conditions. And the way in which this generation looks at itself, at its country, and at the world is going to matter greatly for the way that China is going to act globally and in the way that we in Germany and in Europe and the world generally is going to work with China in many different areas. We're delighted to have Professor Xiang Biao with us today. A very, very warm welcome to MERICS. We're delighted to have you with us. And for colleagues well versed in Chinese reading, Professor Xiang doesn't really need an introduction, but let me just briefly say that Professor Xiang Biao is really one of the most prominent and leading voices on social research on current China and well beyond that. Professor Xiang Biao grew up in the late 70s. He belongs to the generation born just at the end of the Cultural Revolution, grew up in the rather intellectually transitionary period of the 80s, entered university in the 1990s after Tiananmen and at the beginning of China's dynamic market-centered reform era. At the age of 26, Professor Xiang Biao went to Oxford to do his PhD and later worked there as a professor for anthropology. And 2 years ago, he moved to Halle in Germany to head the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology. Professor Xiang Biao's work really goes far beyond China, but today we're happy that he will focus on China. He's the author of several influential and very successful books. As an undergraduate, he was doing field research on China's migrants and how people from Zhejiang moved all over the country and shaped the reform era bottom up. His most successful book is also reflected in the title of today's lecture, Self as Method, Thinking Through China and the World. The Chinese platform Douban ranked it as the most impactful book of 2020. And the reason, of course, is that Xiang Biao has a great talent not only for understanding the most relevant social trends, but also describing them in a way that resonates closely with people in China and well beyond. And we're really grateful and honored to have you with us here at MERICS today. Just 3 quick housekeeping remarks. After the lecture, Katja Drinhausen is going to kick off the discussion with a comment and some reflections of how the insights relate to the research work that we're doing at MERICS on Chinese politics and society. And after that, we will have time for a discussion. Katja and I are going to have questions. You are very welcome to write questions in the chat, and we'll select and bundle questions from there. Please do note that this session is being recorded. And having said that, once again, welcome Professor Xiang Biao to MERICS, and the screen is all yours.
Thank you very much, Bernhard. But Katja, will you say something, or should I start straight away?
Please start right away.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's a great honor, and I wanted to emphasize the fact that even though I'm now in front of screen, but I'm in front of a MERICS screen. I'm sitting in the office of MERICS in the mid town of Berlin, and because I'm really keen to establish contact with colleagues and friends here, but due to other logistical reasons, and it was suggested that a webinar may be more suitable for this particular event. But in any case, I look forward to meet colleagues here, and also in the future, meet audience here in person in the future. The key message of today's remarks, I mean, the main purpose of today's remarks is to get more questions and comments from you, and which will help me think our future research programs in Max Planck Institute, as well as in collaboration with colleagues across Germany and Europe. But there's a specific message I wanted to propose today is that the popular nationalistic sentiment that emerged in the 2000s, especially after 2008, then after the financial crisis in the West, and as symbolized by the successful Beijing Olympics, which was also very much enticed by the sense of humiliation and hurt associated with the disruptions of the torch relay in the West, the sense of hurt among Chinese youth. And that popular nationalism that emerged in later 2000s is, I want to argue, probably is more fragile than it appears, and that may be replaced by another set of sentiment about the relation between the individual self and the nation and the world. And the reason I think that this nationalistic sentiment is fragile, not because of the content of nationalism, of this version of nationalism as somehow articulated ideology. Rather, it is because the relation of this sentiment to people's lived experiences, the structural condition under which this sentiment makes sense to young people, because the condition now changed. So therefore, the meaning of this sentiment also changed. I mean, so therefore, we should not examine nationalism as ideology as if it can be written down in the text and analyzed, but rather it must be understood as a feeling, emotion, a way of making sense of life that is carried out on a daily basis, which is, of course, conditioned by economic, livelihood, and personal family relations, etc. So that is the main argument, and this is related to a larger question about the meaning making, which I think is being relatively neglected in thinking of geopolitics, or in more generally, just in politics in general. As I see it, I think today's world faces a big question, that is the inability of making sense of a very simple mathematical fact, the inability of elites, and especially the elites in the US and in China. This mathematical fact is that China, as a home of a quarter of humanity, will inevitably become a major, if not the most, the leading power in economy, technology, politics, and culture. To be honest, if China failed to develop an economy that is proportionate to its size of population, I think that would be a source of global instability. So China becomes probably the largest economy is inevitable, and it's also good for the stability of the world situation. That is a mathematical fact, simply because they have so many people. But this mathematical fact poses a very serious problem for political elites in the US. I simply cannot imagine a politician in Washington can tell the public, the American public, okay, we have to get ready for these inevitable outcomes. And that probably will be political suicide. But what is funny is the fact that many Chinese politicians also have huge difficulties in facing this mathematical fact. Of course, they have no problem in predicting or even claiming that China will become a major power, become world #1, or probably is already world #1 in some aspects. But they cannot take this development as a mathematical fact. They say the rise of China is a moral question. The rise of China stands for a moral correction of the global order, is somehow a historical event that is correct the injustice in the world, rather than an outcome, just a natural outcome from the fact that there are 1.4 billion people, and 1.4 billion people are working very hard every day and make lots of mistakes, but as well as make lots of innovation, as a result of which you have this aggregate statistical fact that you have China, this piece of land is hosting the largest the largest set of economic activities. But they wanted to make sense, make a meaning of the rise of China through quite ideological and moral lens. That, in my view, create lots of problems and to create lots of distortion, not only internationally, but also domestically. Because if the rise is the reflection of the moral superiority of China, but what about if the decline? If one day the economy is not doing well, so what is your moral standing? So that is you're making yourself very vulnerable by pitch such a high level of sterilization. So that is a question of making a meaning-making question, what I mentioned earlier. So making meaning of world affairs actually is a very deep challenge of modernity. I mean, this the Chinese elite, Chinese intellectuals know this very well. The biggest challenge, the existential challenge that the Chinese elite faced in the end of the 19th century is precisely the replacement of a world, a universe that has its own meaning with a world that is physical, empty, and has no inherent meaning. The Chinese philosopher Zhao Dingyang has articulated this, when he was talking about the tianxia, the all under heaven concept. I mean, in the imperial imaginary of the world does not exist for its own sake. The world exists for a purpose. The purpose is to cultivate the Confucius virtues. The purpose is to convert all the so-called barbarians far away from the Middle Kingdom into the Confucius virtues. And that, of course, has its own positive element too, because as many people point out, the Tianxia model is not a racial category. It's more a spatial rather than racial category. There's no clear divide between Chinese and non-Chinese. As long as you can be cultivated, incorporated in the Confucius thinking, you are all civilized, you are all Chinese. But the problem is that there is no, it is very unequal, hierarchical. You hold the center, then everyone, you can absorb everybody. But anyway, so that the world has its own clear center, has its own moral standard, and it has a direction that the world will move to. So the world is a meaningful existence. But the world order based on nation state is a world that does not have its own inherent internal meaning. And the world, as we look at what happened in West Europe, this is the world order emerged from war, from trade, from religious conflict, from different types of migration driven by the needs of subsistence and survival and etc. None of this act itself has any inherent moral purpose. So it is just an empty physical space in which people make deals with each other. And so the Chinese, the intellectuals feel, my God, we are kind of thrown into a world which has no meaning. So probably this is a kind of a precedent of existential philosophy already. So therefore, the question how you make a meaning of a world that does not have its own inherent meaning, I think is a major challenge of modernity. But the good news is that so far, actually, we have done well in making meaning of a meaningless world. For instance, if you look at the 20th century, we can be quite proud about what we have achieved as a humanity as a whole, because the 20th century witnessed a flourishing of new ideas, new actions to explore how we can live a meaningful life and a more interesting life. So the reason that we can live quite happily and purposefully in a meaningless world is because now we are looking for meaning in life itself. We are looking for meaning in our own actions and practices. We are looking for meaning in how we explore with all kinds of uncertainties. And we're looking for meaning in the way how we define issues, how we face problems, rather than we want to turn to the world, the so-called civilization for meaning, and use that meaning to define our own practices in life. I mean, this again, probably in Germany, this is Kant probably is the person articulated this the earliest and the most beautifully, right? So the immanence, the meaning coming from our practice itself, rather than it's predefined by a divine order, etc. So then I don't want to bore you about the historical review, how we managed that. I mean, for me, actually, the Cold War era is also deeply meaningful era, because it is a period of time people contest about different social arrangements in a quite a meaningful way. People ask questions: is this good? Is this just? Etc. But anyway, so when we with the end of the Cold War, so I think Fukuyama does have get something right. There is a sense of end of history. So the world as if it go back to a meaningless world in the sense because now, precisely because we feel, okay, now we know what is there's only single direction move to. But this direction itself has no meaning. It is that we're moving to a direction of free market. It's about material interest maximization. It's all about proceduralism. We make laws and in order to make economic transaction more smoothly, etc., rather than the meaning of life. So I think that at that time, probably when the Berlin Wall fell, probably we all in a state of euphoria, and people probably was not thinking what it means later on. But now we look back, probably at that time, I think the fall of the Berlin Wall already sowed some seeds for some troubles that we are facing. So the loss of question of meaning. So now I come to the question that some of you may be directly interested in, is about how shall we understand the popular nationalism, which appeared to be quite aggressive, assertive, and especially in the form of so-called war for warriors. I mean, personally, I was quite surprised to see war for warriors because it's so different from the standard Chinese state international relations gesture. You look at how the Chinese foreign affairs post-persons changed in their style and speech, especially in previous years. That was very revealing to me. About how the sentiment changed and the relation between state and the people also changed in this regard, in the regard of how you imagine the world. Then how I wanted to suggest that assertive popular nationalism is very much related to a sense of self, individual self, and this individual self is very self-centered and is seeking a material benefit for the self, but nevertheless very readily hatch the self or attach itself to this grand narrative about China's rise and the national regionalization. So therefore, the first point to emphasize that the popular nationalism is not an ideology of collectivism, because that popular nationalism is not just to say we Chinese people must have a strong solidarity, we share a common future, etc. Of course, they say all the things, but this is not how drive people believing certain things or say certain things. The things that really make young people tick was a sense of the rise of China is an opportunity for the development of the individual self. No? So therefore, the nationalism ideology is primarily an ideology of individualism. That's number one. Number two, that individualism is an individualism that starts with an empty self, rather than start with you can say a full self. What do I mean by that? Because the whole notion of self-development that became widespread in the 1990s, actually not so much in the 1980s, it's mainly in 1990s, especially after 1992. This what normally people will call the neoliberal market, very radically market-oriented economic reform was in full swing. So the sense of self-development is based on self-negation. The idea is always, the self now is not good enough. The self now is something that you have to transcend. The self now is something you have to deny. So you have to move away from yourself now, and you move towards something is better than now. So and this is you can say it's a start with empty self. So then the history of a self, how exactly you feel as a very specific human being and a person, is not important. Your own feeling, you feel a little sad or a bit of a melancholy, and these things are what need to be suppressed. You need to suppress that in order to be more efficient, in order to be more focused, in order to move ahead fast. So that is the self-negation. The second, I think, a characteristic of this national kind of, you can say, the nationalistic individualism. And the third feature is that this sense of self, of course, then work together with the historical period in which China's economy growing fast, very well. There is a structural match between that sense of self and the macro political economy, at least in three ways. The first way is that because the economy was growing very fast, so therefore the feeling that you can constantly negate the self, you can constantly move towards a better self and changing your living standard. And it is feasible and easily realistic. And many young people feel proud about. So this is number one. Number two, it is precisely through this constant self-negation and the tremendous energy is mobilized from the population itself, which is absolutely essential for the continuous rise of China's economy. So China's economy would not have grown so fast without this individual self-negation. The people are willing to sacrifice a lot of daily happiness, so even we would regard it as a necessity in order for a imagined brighter future. I mean, I use a notion of suspension to describe that condition, that kind of existential condition. You suspend friendship, you suspend like the need of sleep, you suspend the needs to spend time with the children in order to work more, work harder. Imagine, okay, once I arrive at a certain point, then everything will be okay. No? So that is a sounds a very individual lifestyle question, but when you put it together, 1.1 billion people are doing that, and the result is a phenomenal. So that is the second point, is that kind of nationalistic individualism became actually a source of energy that sustains the economic growth. And the third aspect in this structural matching between the sense of self and China's rise is that when people keep doing that, live in the situation of suspension, they do feel sense of anxiety. They do have a sense of meaninglessness, and they have a feeling of empathy. As I mentioned earlier, because the starting point is always the self is empathy, self is to be neglected, and the meaning always comes from the improvement. The meaning is always come from imagined promise, but this is not something you can control. This is something you can strive for, but it can never, is always beyond your control. So there is a deep sense of insecurity, and also feelings often feel burned out and exhausted. And that create a condition that nationalistic sentiment makes great sense, give meaning to this way of existence. So just imagine you feel tired and you are not sure about the future. And of course, if you can imagine that now you are not alone, you and many others now are riding on a giant boat, and this boat is going to march forward in the ocean unstoppably. Of course, that will give you a great sense of security and satisfaction. And if you feel tired and daily work is so hard, but you start imagining, oh, it's not just my own selfish activities, but it is part of the grand project for the national regeneration. And then you will spend the day with greater ease, and probably you will sleep better. So these are three ways. So then that kind of sentiment and the nationalistic ideology come together. And this also explains why many young people will use rather aggressive language to express this sentiment. I mean, aggressive language not towards foreigners, I must emphasize. And often the language are very aggressive and even brutal towards fellow citizens. So because the divide within in the social media within China is much more, I think, troublesome than how they treat the foreigners. And if you, I mean, like during the COVID and the Japanese nuclear water, the leaking, releasing water polluted by nuclear radiation, etc. The way the Chinese use to describe a fellow citizens who disagree with them is quite brutal. I mean, I personally feel it quite troublesome. But then I'm thinking of it, like, why they are so brutal? I mean, there's no reason for them to develop any genuine hatred towards your fellow citizen who simply have slightly different views. And on matters that does not, I mean, you have no control, and we don't know what's really going on, right? Why do you make such a big deal? And I think it's not a real, it's not the language sounds so brutal, aggressive. It's not really, I think it's not based on genuine hatred. It's more due to this structural condition under which this sentiment developed. Because this is a empty self jumped into a quite abstract ideology and with very little meaningful communication with fellow citizens. And this is a process of meaning that is not based on concrete life experiences, but it's really based on a need for a grand meaning to fill some void in life. And then is often learned and in turn expressed in abstract categories and often emotionally charged categories. And this is this style, we would say the style of practicing ideology that make them so aggressive. No? So, I mean, this is not to say that we should not take it seriously, but it's also important to point out we should not take it as a, they really mean that. It is because of the way how they develop this feelings that determines the way how they express it. I mean, the consequence is quite real. Once you start using such a brutal language, of course, you damage the social fabric. You damage the possibility of having more meaningful and deeper communication among Chinese population. I mean, for us as social scientists, it's very sad. Then why situation may change? I think it's, again, you need to go back to the structural condition, how the sense of self and the macro economy and the politics come together. I think that structural condition now is being challenged. And for various reasons. Number one is just the accumulation of, very simple accumulation of tiredness, accumulation of exhaustion, and etc. So therefore, the feeling of euphoria and things always go forward, and I can swallow my exhaustion at this moment for better future. I mean, that just became less sustainable. It sounds nothing profound, but that is how society evolves. Number two is, of course, economic stagnation. And then, the feeling that they will always have a brighter future, and people are riding a giant historical tide, which is unstoppable. That sense feeling is being challenged. And also, it is something contingent, but it's quite important. I think COVID did play a very important role. And the reason that COVID lockdown play an important role is precisely because it is not about this policy, the specific policy was correct or wrong, was evidence-based or not, but the way how COVID lockdown was implemented did send some existential shock for young people. The thing that if you look at the social media, especially those from Shanghai, what we notice is that young people particularly traumatized by things like the office, we don't know who, I mean, they are all in the full white, costumes in the raided private home and took a person away to a quarantine center without a warning, without a consent. And that is so traumatic because in the previous time, many young people believed that if you accumulated enough wealth, if you can have your own private property, your own apartment in a nice area in Shanghai, and life would be wonderful. why, you will have a very, then they say, we can forget about politics, etc. This is my private paradigms. But once that was challenged, there is some existential shock. And then also there's some stories, which is very new for Chinese. For instance, the question about the pets, question about books. When officers came to do what is the word? In order to kill all the virus in the parliament, then young people found that their books or their music, the CDs were damaged, and they feel very sad. You can say, oh, this is all very small thing, very trivial. But for people's sentiment of feeling, it is these small things matter. And it is precisely these small things were suppressed before. So you can establish a sense of empathy and very hardworking, energetic self, right? But if when I think the COVID has this kind of a total existential shock to some extent, especially for urban educated youth, and suddenly they see this side of the self. I'm not a person just go to work and to earn money to have a property. I'm a person who likes reading certain books, likes listening to certain type of music, and I'm a person who want to have certain routines with my friends, and I'm a person feel particularly sad about certain things, and etc. So then the self become fuller. And then my final point related to this is, I think, the fourth reason why the structural condition under which the nationalistic individualism could be challenged is have something to do with gender politics. As many China observers would agree, that I think gender politics is playing a quite important role in changing how social life is organized and how people, especially young people, think of their own personal life as well as thinking of collective lives. Why? Why does gender play such an important role? I mean, in the West, somehow, because we emphasize lots of the importance of gender, somehow we feel all this is somehow natural. But it's true. Actually, it's not. I mean, why the gender politics have become particularly powerful and has such particularly effective in mobilizing people to think life differently? Precisely because gender and sexuality is deeply personal. It is not something you can easily suppress. Even you suppress at one moment, it will come back. So it is not something that you can get rid of, and in order to make yourself an empty and pure economic actor. So every human being has a very specific gender role, has very specific sexuality, and that is not something you can treat in abstract terms. How your colleagues talk to you and how you are treated, what you wear makeup or not, what kind of clothes you should wear in what occasion, etc. That constantly reminds you that you are a very specific person with all kinds of characteristics. Right? So, I mean, when you shift the attention to this dimension of life more, so I think then people will feel that that kind of grand narrative that used to be very meaningful and energizing for them probably become less effective in capturing their imagination. And this coupled with the situation of economic stagnation, with just psychological burnout, as well as the international environment as well. So all about China's rise internationally is being also replaced with a kind of a China suspicion mood. But I must emphasize actually that does not play too much role, because that could be interpreted in different ways. That actually could be used to further enhance the aggressive nationalistic sentiment. People say, oh, so the foreigners are getting even more jealous with us, and etc. But what is really important is the internal and the daily life situation. Yeah. So then what will go from here? And that's, of course, I don't have a crystal ball to predict. But what I think is important is I invite all of you to think together. I mean, how we as researchers, as policymakers, as diplomats, or as a business person who have something to do with China, face that, and how we can have more discussions that will link people's, especially young people, ordinary young people's meaning making in their life with the global geopolitical questions. So therefore, we will avoid a situation that state elites and the policymakers just make the meaning of the world in their head, as I said in the very beginning. I mean, now you how to face mathematical question of China's rise. Is that it could be very consequential because it could create lots of conflicts unnecessarily, lots of conflicts. But if we can change the global map of meaning making in a way that people's voice can become more visible, probably that is a good thing for global peace. Yeah, I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Xiang Biao, for a very rich and deep lecture. And I dare to say that you did make a lot of meaning for us here. Let me hand right over to my colleague Katja Drinhausen, who heads our Politics and Society research team here at MERICS. And I already see colleagues writing questions in the chat. We'll take some of them later. We'll collect them all for then thinking about them in more depth and following up on some of these things in our research at a later date. But for now, Katja, over to you for a first reaction.
Thank you, Bernhard, and also thank you, Xiang Biao, for the just immensely rich remarks on this topic. I want to pick up actually on a couple of themes that also run through your book, which I think we posted the link to in the invitation because fantastically it's open source, so people can read through just long, interview with you and kind of understand better what your approach is. But in your book, or in the interviews, you talk a lot about the tension between words and reality, and between official structures and the individual and the self, and especially on the issue of words. And I think this already addresses one of the questions raised in the chat. What does the government do top down with words to actually keep or get the younger generations to buy in? And this is also something that we analyze as part of an ongoing project here at MERICS called China Spectrum. So looking at the spectrum of different opinions of sense-making of the world and discussions in the Chinese general public, while also tracking developments in official regulations and guidelines that seek to kind of mainstream different positions and kind of making sense of the world. I'm thinking here especially about kind of introduction of more national education, national security education, educational Xi Jinping thought, and for example the new patriotism law that is now coming into effect, that really again kind of more formalizes and standardizes what the younger generations are supposed to think. So on the one hand, you have that kind of imposition of structures. On the other hand, as you described so well in your remarks, you have a vastly different reality compared to even a decade or 2 decades ago. Yes. We're talking here about the themes that you already mentioned, labor market, costs of daily living, mortgages, and the sense of insecurity that is also reflected to some extent in the many or a rising number of young people in China try to get back into state employ. And this is actually one of the discussions we looked at in our project in the past year. So kind of this willingness to apply for government jobs, even if the pay isn't that great to get back into the system and to have the protection of the system. And to some extent, that has a very kind of closed off to the world mindset. At the same time, we have these, indicators of insecurity and frustration with the terminology that you see, especially in online spaces, of lying flat, runology, involution. So all, wording around the fact that the self is kind of express, and again, part of sense making, but something where it's faced towards the inner self, rather than kind of entering what you just said, a discussion about China's place also in the world in bigger geopolitical questions. And what I found really quite striking, both from our own research, but also from reading your works, is the fact that something is missing. And what is missing is the spirit that you describe quite well in your book as well, of the entrepreneurs, of the people that kind of started transformations bottom up. For example, migrants going from Zhejiang into the capital, starting business. Kind of this bottom-up willingness to challenge assumptions and go out and to interact with the world. And to maybe kind of wrap that up into a question, where do you see, I guess, China and these different streams going? So the tension between, rising nationalism on the one hand and the willingness to, concentrate on the self or even emigrate on the other hand. And where do you see that kind of bottom-up innovation or willingness to innovate and to take risks in the future?
Thank you, Katja. Yeah, first of all, I think what you mentioned, that there is a kind of trend of withdrawal among young people, right? Like a retreat from the outside world and back just to build the private self, because of the outside world is so turmoil and full of insecurity. And this appear to be a process of depoliticization. They say, oh, too much to handle. I don't want to think about too much, and also avoid the discussion because it's so divisive and etc. This is what's going on, and we all understand why young people do that. And personally, I feel that is actually deeply political in my framework. Because if you don't have this kind of reflexive moment, if you don't retreat from the overheated market over last decades, in which process all the meanings, all the deeper questions were suspended, then you would not be able to establish a really thinking and reflexive self. So now this moment, lie flat, lie flat is primarily you can say, sentimental gesture. It's not really action. Very few people can stop really working. But anyway, so that kind of going back to the self appear to be apolitical or even depoliticizing, but it could have very rich political consequences. This is number one. Number two is what you mentioned is how to see the what we witnessed in the 1980s. They have a bottom-up incentives and innovation to change a society. I think that is probably not going to happen very soon for various reasons, because the whole the whole way how society is governed is so different now compared to 1980s. Everything is digitalized and the cameras are everywhere, and the surveillance is so thorough, and also the informal economy, which was the basis of many innovations in the 1980s, basically is shrinking. It hardly exists today. But the bottom-up energy is still there. And how that would be articulated and express itself, I don't have very clear answer yet. But my sense is that probably, if the 1980s, this economic entrepreneurship is a way how people express their social energy. Entrepreneurship appears to be just a money-making process, but if you look at the history, look at the 1980s, what really it means. It is a way, money-making actually is a way how people express their social energy. They are saying, we want to change how our life is organized. We want to change the way how we will invest our energy, how we decide what kind of thing that we want to spend the time on, what kind of thing we want to pay attention to, and etc. So in my framework, so the economic entrepreneurship is a way of expressing social views and distributing social energy. If in the 1980s it was primarily done through economic entrepreneurship, I think probably in today's the domain of culture, the domain of meaning making will become more important. And when you people have different views of self and life, have views regarding question like dignity and gender roles and what a good life is, and their behavior will change. If a primary school and a middle high school, a nurse, a doctor, a grassroots bureaucrats, if the way they see the world and the behavior change, and then probably there will be some bottom-up change too. Yeah, and we do have some small examples. Young people migrate back to the countryside, start a kind of a new lifestyle, experiment a new lifestyle, or some people experiment new ways of teaching kids and raising kids and etc. Very small scale, but that is that's one possible way out. Yeah. So that's thank you very much for your question.
Thank you. We have quite a number of fascinating questions in the chat. We'll not be able to go through all of them, but I'll throw you a couple of them, Xiang Biao, and ask you for quick responses. The first one on religion. What is the role that religion plays for China's youth today?
So far, this is not a part of my expertise, I must admit. The religion, so far, there is no strong evidence to show that the religion will play an important role in shaping young people's worldview in China. But then we do witness the rise of quasi-religious activities, such as, fortune telling and these oracles they become very popular among young Chinese. And my interpretation is that this kind of activity, I would go to temples to offer some offerings before exams or during New Year. That is not, I don't see that is a question of religion, because the religion will give you a different set and articulated worldview, and which will define who you are and etc. But now all this kind of quasi-religious spiritual activities became so popular because they actually are a means. They are now being used as a device for young people to think of some quite mundane and secular questions in their life. I give you a very quick example. Who are the most, I talk to some people doing this fortune telling business online, and then they say, oh, last year I charged only 2 RMB per minute, but now I can charge you 25 RMB per minute, and become very popular. And then I ask, oh, why do you think you are so popular, etc.? Because they are good narrators. They are very skillful in asking questions and provide a space for the person who now consulting them to tell their life experiences. So this fortune telling is not about telling the future, is more about an opportunity to reflect on their past life experiences, to talk about what their life problem is and facing now. And is not dissimilar from psychological counseling. So that is, of course, tied to my own framework, how this empathy individualism is now being replaced by a fuller, more personal sense of individual, and this spiritual activities is a way for them to, as a device that the young people are using to think of their personal past, the personal feelings, personal memories.
Thank you. There's quite a number of questions here that are going into the direction of nationalism and how successful state-constructed national narratives actually are. One colleague here is saying that she recently went to red museums and there were not a lot of people there at all. We all know that there's huge nationalistic education campaigns going on. Could you elaborate a little bit more on how attractive this narrative actually is to young people, and in what ways exactly it shapes their not only thoughts, but actually what they do, their actions, their life decisions?
Yeah, I think this is also a question Katja mentioned earlier. There is nowadays a patriotic education law is being passed. Is already passed, right? I'm not sure. Yeah, and then the various type of campaigns is going on. Certainly they have impacts because if you invest so much energy and time in schools from very young, that you can capture the kids from very young age and soak them into this certain languages and image, that certainly will shape their thinking. And then what does this mean if you have all these kind of campaigns that start very early stage of education? You are not teaching nationalism. You are actually shaping a new cognitive framework. So for the young kids, of course, they learn all these words, nationalism, etc. But what is the real impact is that they will feel only these kind of grand things are meaningful. They will pick up messages such as, an individual can be sacrificed, sometimes must be sacrificed for the bigger good. And life itself is meaningless unless it serves something else. No? So this is, if you just imagine from kindergarten, if you receive this kind of message again and again, then the whole cognitive structure will be shaped in that way, which but the nationalism is just one specific set of languages that will make such a cognitive structure works. And then what's the consequence? Though that's, I think it is, of course, is serious because so many people are being communicating that way. And but I don't think it's necessarily make everyone nationalistic, because that will create a situation. Me as a Chinese, I think the biggest problem resulted from these campaigns is not that people will become more nationalistic than otherwise, even though that can be the case, but rather it will become communication nearly impossible and will make the population more divided. So it's a bit of similar to the censorship question. Even though you have all this nationalistic campaign, for sure there are many people, they privately, they believe otherwise. And we know, how strict the censorship is implemented in the social media, but we all know, no matter how strict the censorship is, and then the different opinions, the different views, and different information is always there. But this does not mean the censorship or nationalistic education does not work. But it works in different way. What way? It will make opinions and feelings become more likely to become extreme, more likely to radicalize people's perceptions. No? Go back to the question, how to understand the nationalistic campaign as a campaign about cognition rather than campaign about ideology, about the belief. is that once you think, okay, there's a one single principle that we must adhere, and this principle is not something we can test through our own experience. It's something you have to believe, black and white. And some people, precisely because that, some people will make an opposite argument to say, oh, this is all wrong. You know, we must have some different set of principle. We also have to believe. So then when I say the infrastructure of communication is becoming undermined for two reasons. Number one, the view itself become very divisive. And number two, both schools of thinking are no longer rooted in life experiences that people can observe and their personal feeling directly attached to. And they are all doing the opposite. They are using the life experience selectively in order to prove their belief, their faith. No? As a bit, I mean, a simplistic analogy is a bit of going back to the medieval ideology, I mean, religious belief. No? You exist for the sake of the belief that top down, or you exist in order to oppose the certain belief, rather than you start with your own existence. I mean, that is my my assessment of this campaign. And then what the researchers or parents can do, I think you don't need to be too to say, oh, you tell kids, oh, this is wrong, etc. That is just, you know, create too much confusion for kids. Maybe alternative art education, more music, storytelling, also what the teachers can do. I know lots of teachers and the parents are doing that. You bring back life experiences. So you don't work at the level or in the domain of ideology, because that's dangerous and that's create all kinds of problems. You work through the domain of cognition. You ask kids, how do you know that's true? I mean, you believe it's the correct. Can you tell me, you know, is this more correct than, you know, you use my parents' money to buy too much candy, etc. So you make it concrete, and then you try to keep the cognitive structure open and flexible. And I think that's doable. And if we do that, so the negative consequences of the nationalistic campaign can be mitigated through each and every individual's effort.
Maybe I can come in here with a couple of questions and comments from the discussion that is very lively and we're trying to monitor and keep up with. Because as one commentator remarked, it's I think something that was also reflected in our research at MERICS of public debates, that very often it's not an either or, right? You're not nationalist kind of 24/7 and have kind of other concerns or feelings or discuss, you know, lying flat and evolution, but obviously public sentiment and public opinion in China is also going through fundamental shifts and changes. And you have talked about, for example, the COVID lockdown as being quite a transformative event. And that's, I think, something that we've seen in social media spaces or like public commentary in China as well, that some of the people that kind of staunchly lauded the party around the 100th anniversary of the CCP a year later, when faced with the realities, again, not the words of the party, but the realities of living under really harsh kind of socio-political times, had a very different opinion and were quite critical and kind of demanding different rights and spaces for individuals just a year and a half later. So I think the fluidity of public opinion and that people obviously can have various considerations at the same time is maybe an important point to add here. And I want to tag onto that a question also from the audience. You asked or focused on the topic of, you know, how especially China's youth thinks about the future, but how do you do that in terms of methodological approach, especially as a scholar that is now based in Germany? So what are your maybe reading recommendations also for those in the audience that study China themselves?
Oh, thank you. No, that's tied to the very nice summary of audience question as well. You know, the situation is so fluid and dynamic. So I think as I mean, if you ask the methodology question, I don't know how successful I have been, but I'm just now I'm not talking about my own experience, but I'm thinking in ideal situation, person who are more capable than me could do at least two things. Number one is it's not just a practical method, it's also a question of perspective. The perspective is that if you start with a assumption that the things are all quite fixed, you know, there's a very clear structure, you know, government will do this and people are either captured or people resist, you know, you either incorporate or you are against. And then you will never to get how people feel. As Katja, you mentioned, ordinary people in their life, of course, they face all kinds of complex issues. So the thing is, they may, at a particular moment, because they are not scholars, so they often use a very black and white, sometimes extreme words to express. But this does not mean they really believe in it, because tomorrow's situation is different. So you have to listen. What does it say? And think what really they mean? What does it really express? And keep the mind open rather than think just this or that. So that is the first step to get close to what the young people are thinking, what they are doing, and what they can do, and what they may do. And the second, the more practical, I think social media is such a wonderful tool. And then there's lots of information. But here again, we will have to mix the method of following social media posts with some sustained personal connections. Again, social media can be quite distorting. Social media give you interesting clues. Something that may be going on, you know, there's one spark here, one spark there. But what really this spark means, you know, how significant it is. Again, you know, they use a very colorful language to easily capture attention. But how serious it is, then you need some sustained long-term personal relations to gauge that. So that is my there's the two levels. Number one is a more theoretical perspective. You think of I mean, yeah. So think of the China will change. And actually is changing every day. Just simply we cannot detect yet. Second is a more practical method. But now I just want to emphasize a little more about the first point is, you know, this is, I mean, given the size of China, the only way for China to change in a sustainable way is a change from within. So this again go back to the question of immanence, you know, the change coming from practice, the change of mind and behavior of people, young people, and that is the only source of change. But if we don't engage with that, so all kinds of commentaries and criticism are either wishful thinking or simply false predictions that to satisfy our own fantasy from outside, rather than reading history as history is unfolding now.
Let me wrap up with one last question. You started out with a mathematical fact of China's size. Several colleagues in the chat have mentioned that India also makes up a quarter of the world's population.
Yes.
Others even point to Africa. So I would ask you, in wrapping up, because I know that you've also done field work in India.
Yes.
How would you compare Chinese youth and youth in India? And maybe if you want to go that far, you've worked in Oxford for many years, you're working in Halle now. If you look at European or Western youth and bring them into the comparison, how do these different young generations compare in your mind?
That's a fascinating question. I have not, Bernhard, you caught me now on screen. Yes, and I have not thought of that. I'm obviously I don't have any evidence or careful thinking in order to make any meaningful suggestion. But that kind of question I think it's useful to generate some hypothesis, generate some question marks for ourselves for think with. And India and China, I think, is a very interesting comparison because India almost in many aspects looks like China in the 1990s and 2000s. And then you become very confident and led by clearly authoritarian and very nationalistic. I must say, probably the Modi version of nationalism is even more narrowly based than the Chinese version. There's a horrible, very problematic ethno-religious dimension outright. So I mean, China at least is the official line is always multi-ethnic harmony, but India is the Hindutva related. And then, but that is an interesting question because that type of ideology can be very energizing and can be very effective in mobilizing the population for economic improvement, for economic growth. So that is interesting. I mean, and then it may come, the burnout and later make the social development less sustainable and the social fabric being ruptured. I mean, that is also happening in India already. But that is a dilemma. How we deal with that, and if you talk to middle class educated IT professionals, Hindu, they are quite happy, and they the sense of the move towards a brighter future and the optimistic, which is a spirit that we also feel we need. It's a kind of nice spirit because it's an energizing spirit. But how to handle that? That's the question. And then the European youth is I have not really done any research about that, but this seems to be they have quite pessimistic in general, especially regarding the future growth and the climate change. But thoughtful, because their self is certainly not empty. They start with a full self, but they feel that the world is becoming empty. The world is moving away from their personal ideals and etc. So instead of making comparative studies of different parts of the world, I think probably it can be quite interesting to bring the youth in different parts of the world into conversation. Probably the Chinese youth can share their experiences over the last 2 or 3 decades with the Indian counterparts. And then the European youth also can listen, but also share their history. And they are quite a meaningful critique of the world. But the problem is that there's a lack of energy for the current activities to take initiatives, right? I mean, this they probably can pick something from the Indian and the Chinese youth. And this, in the future, of course, the world is already is a very connected but deeply divided. And I think probably this is a role that scholar can play as a bridge to raise some questions that people in different parts of the world all feel related to and feel interested in dialoguing with other the people in other parts of the world. Yeah, I also regard this as a job that we in Halle want to pursue. Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's also a job that we at MERICS try to pursue. This is an excellent note to end on for today's MERICS Future China lecture. Thank you very, very much, Professor Xiang Biao, for your time and for your thoughts and for your insights. If we live, as you try to convince us, in a meaningless world, you definitely helped us to forget that today. Thank you, everyone, for listening. We went a little over time, and We will go over time again, of course, in future discussions, and at looking at all the questions in the chat that we didn't have the time to tackle today. Thank you very much for today, and we very much look forward to continuing the discussion. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.